Marianne stood up in the middle of Christmas dinner and announced that she had reported my addiction recovery center to the federal government for fraudulent and unsafe practices. She said it in the same tone someone might use to congratulate themselves for donating toys to a children's hospital, calm and controlled, with her hands resting lightly on the back of her chair as if she had rehearsed this moment and wanted to get the posture just right. For a breathless second, the room went completely still. Then my uncle clapped, my aunt followed. Soon the entire table was applauding her, offering nods of admiration and murmurs of how brave she was to speak up. Brave. As if she had risked something. As if turning on your own sister in front of your entire family counted as moral courage. Dad nodded toward her with approval that cut sharper than anything she said. Mom looked down at her plate and folded her napkin again, even though it was already perfectly square. No one looked at me. I sat there with my hands in my lap and my back straight, trying to keep my breath slow and steady. Shock always comes quietly for me. It is never loud or dramatic. It settles like cold water spilling down my spine, soaking into everything I thought I knew. I was not angry. Not yet. What I felt was the sudden realization that I had walked into a room where everyone else already knew their lines, and I was the only one who did not have a script. People think betrayal is loud. They imagine shouting or slamming doors or whispered accusations behind closed blinds, but this was soft, gentle even. A betrayal delivered with a holiday centerpiece on the table and cinnamon in the air. If you are listening to this right now, maybe while cooking dinner or sitting in your car or trying to get through a long drive, I want you to picture exactly where you were the last time someone blindsided you. I can tell you exactly where I was, the far end of the dining table, the one with the slightly crooked leg. Christmas lights reflecting off the window behind Marianne as she declared herself the family's savior. And if you want to stay with me through this story, feel free to tell me where you are listening from or subscribe, so you do not miss what happened next. Because the truth is stranger than anything I could have imagined that night. After the applause faded, Marianne kept speaking. She said she had no choice. She said she could not sit back and watch me continue to endanger vulnerables, people with my unconventional treatment approach. She said she had tried to talk to me, though she never had. Her voice never wavered. She did not look at me. She looked at Dad, seeking confirmation that she had done the right thing, and Dad gave it to her with a single approving nod. My fork rested untouched on my plate. I could hear the soft scrape of someone cutting into a slice of ham, the gentle clink of a wine glass being lifted. Christmas music hummed under everything cheerful and painfully inappropriate. I wondered if anyone at the table felt even a flicker of discomfort. Not one person hesitated to praise her for reporting my center, something I had built with my own 2 hands, something I had poured my savings and my heart into. Mom finally glanced up, her eyes darting toward mine before slipping away like she had touched something hot in an accident. She did not speak. I do not know if she was scared or ashamed, or simply unwilling to choose between her daughters in a room that demanded clear sides. But silence is a choice too. Marianne lifted her wine glass, waiting for someone to toast her. When no one did, she lowered it again with a small shrug and sat down slowly, still keeping her gaze fixed anywhere but on me. It was not the accusation that cut the deepest. It was the certainty in her tone, the way she spoke as if her words were facts, the way my family embraced her version of me without ever asking me to speak. For myself, I felt like an outsider in a place that had once felt like home, a stranger at my own family's table. The worst part was that Marianne believed she was right, that she was the responsible one, that she was protecting people. She had always been my favorite, the one who walked the path our parents approved of, the one whose choices made sense to everyone except me. The room around me blurred for a moment, not visually or not emotionally. The faces, the voices, the lights, all of it smudged into something distant. I sat perfectly still while the realization settled in they had wanted this to be true. That was why they accepted it so quickly. They had been waiting for a reason to believe I had made a mistake, that I had failed, that my work was something they could dismiss with a single announcement from Marianne. Dad cleared his throat and said he admired courage, especially when it came from a place of protecting the vulnerable. He did not mention that the people I worked with were the vulnerable. He did not acknowledge that my life had been dedicated to caring for those everyone else forgot. He simply affirmed Marianne and in doing so erased me. I could have argued. I could have demanded to know what she told them, what she sent in her report, who she talked to. I could have defended every piece of data, every treatment plan, every recovery story. I could have stood up and shouted until my voice broke, but I knew exactly how that would be interpreted. Defensive, emotional, irrational. The sister who could not take criticism. The one who abandoned a prestigious medical career for a passion project, the applauded. Family barely understood. So instead I picked up my napkin, placed it carefully beside my plate, and pushed my chair back. My voice was quiet when I said I needed some air. No one tried to stop me. No one asked me to stay. No one said they wanted to hear my side. I walked toward the front door feeling strangely calm. The way you do after hearing news so shocking, your brain decides to take the long way around to process it. As I stepped outside, the cold December air hit my face, sharp enough to make my eyes water, though I refused to let the tears fall. The world outside was quiet. Snow layered the yard, glittering faintly under the porch light. The breath leaving my body hung in front of me like smoke. I listened to the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation slipping through the door behind me and wondered how many times I had swallowed moments like this without acknowledging the bruise they left. I walked toward my car, the snow crunching under each step. For a moment, I simply stood there with my hand on the door handle, looking at the sky above my parents' house. A dark winter sky I had grown up under, a place I once believed would always be safe. But that night it felt incredibly small, like a box I had outgrown but kept climbing back into out of habit. Any other person might have collapsed in anger or grief, but all I felt was clarity, a cold, sharp understanding that Marianne had not done this because she thought I was harmful. She had done it because she needed to be right, and Dad needed her to be right, and Mom needed the family to stay balanced, even if it meant balancing on my back. My recovery center was not perfect. No center ever is, but it was real. It was honest. It was the place where people had taken their first steps toward sobriety, often after losing everything else. This report she filed was not simply an attack on me. It was an attack on the people who trusted us, on the staff who worked through the night, on the community we served. Marianne did not see them. To her, they were abstractions. Risks, numbers, problems to be contained. To me, they were faces, names, stories, people who mattered. I got into my car and turned on the engine. The heater sputtered to life with a tired groan. I pulled out of the driveway slowly, watching the house shrink in my rearview mirror. The lights blurred as I blinked, but I still did not cry. I drove in silence, letting the road absorb everything I could not say at that table. My hands stayed steady on the wheel. My breath stayed even. The world outside passed in soft streaks of holiday color, and yet none of it felt festive anymore. I did not know then what the coming weeks would bring. I did not know an inspector would walk into my office, freeze at the sight of a photograph on my wall, and change the course of everything that followed. I did not know Marianne would face consequences of her own, or that she would finally see the damage she caused. All I knew was that I had just witnessed the moment my family chose their truth over mine, and that choice would echo through every part of my life until the day I finally stopped trying to earn a place at a table that had no seat for me. That night, as I pulled into my apartment complex and stared at the glowing windows of the AG building across from mine, I realized something else. I was not broken. I was not defeated. I was not even lost. I was done. And that was the quiet beginning of everything that came next. I was done. That thought stayed with me the whole night, curling into the corners of my mind as I brushed my teeth, changed into old sweats, and climbed into bed without turning on the television. But the moment the room went dark, something else surfaced, rising slowly from a place I had tried for years to keep sealed. Caleb, my little brother. The first person I ever failed. Long before Marianne stood up at Christmas dinner and declared herself the casual guardian of public safety. I closed my eyes and let the memory pull me backward, not because I wanted to relive it, but because I could never move forward without touching where it began. I used to think I understood what failing someone meant. Missing a birthday, arguing too harshly, forgetting to call. Those were small failures. human ones. But when Caleb fell apart, I learned what real failure felt like. A slow unraveling you could see happening in front of you, one thread at a time, and still be powerless to stop. Caleb had been brilliant when he was younger, the kind of kid who took apart radios and put them back together just to see, if he could. He had a grin that lit up his whole face and a way of making even the most serious people laugh without meaning to. I used to believe he would grow into someone extraordinary. Maybe that was part of the problem. When he started slipping, none of us wanted to see it for what it was. It began quietly. A sprained ankle from a landscaping job, a prescription for painkillers. The kind doctors handed out freely back then without understanding what they were really giving people. He said they helped him sleep. He said they made the pain manageable. No one questioned anything. Why would we pills were normal? Medication was normal. Pain was supposed to be treated. And the people writing the prescriptions knew what they were doing. Dad believed that completely. Mom, too. They were from a generation that trusted authority without hesitation. Doctors knew best. Pharmacists were the gatekeepers of safety. Caleb was simply following his treatment plan. That was how they saw it. Not once did they look at him and wonder if the plan itself was broken. I was a medical resident at the time, still in the sharp, hungry stage of my career, when every day felt like a test of endurance. I thought I knew how the world worked because I could recite symptoms in my sleep and make diagnoses faster than anyone else in my program. When Caleb mentioned he was taking more pills than usual, I told him to be careful. I said it gently at first. He brushed it off. Then I said it more firmly. He laughed and said he had it under control. The first time Mom found him nodding off at the dinner table, she insisted he was tired from work. Dad said stress affected everyone differently. Marianne, who was already deep into pharmacy school at that point, went over his prescriptions line by line and said everything looked typical. Appropriate, expected. My entire family looked at the paperwork instead of looking at him. Caleb grew thinner. His jokes came less often. His eyes lost that spark I used to brag about whenever I talked about him. He spent more time in his room and less time anywhere that required conversation. I tried to talk to him one night while driving him home after he called me for a ride. He stared out the window and said he was fine. Men always say they are fine right before they fall apart. A few months later, he was in trouble at work. Clients complained he seemed out of it. His supervisor warned him twice. Dad gave him a lecture about responsibility. Mom cooked his favorite meals, hoping food could fix what she did not understand. Marianne suggested a different doctor to adjust the prescription. Not once did anyone say the word addiction out loud. Not even me. I thought I was helping by being calm, by being clinical. I thought if I stayed steady, he would follow suit. Addiction does not care how steady you are. One night he showed up at my apartment with tears in his eyes, asking if I could help him get off the medication. That was the moment I should have seen everything clearly. He was reaching for me, for help, for someone to break the silence that had been suffocating him. But all I did was tell him I would call his doctor and schedule an appointment. I followed the rules because that was what I had been trained to do. I believed systems existed for a reason. I believed professionals would know what to do. I believed the right forms and referrals would save him. The appointment took place 2 weeks later. By then he had already started withdrawing. Shaking, sweating, panicked. The doctor adjusted his dosage and told him it would stabilize soon. It did not. It got worse. He spiraled. He hid it from everyone except me, and even then only in fragments. I begged him to let me take him to the hospital, but he refused. He said he did not want Dad to know. He said he did not want to disappoint Mom. He said Marianne would judge him. I told him none of that mattered. He said it mattered more than anything. I should have driven him anyway. The night he died is stamped into my memory with a clarity I wish I could wash away. It was late summer of 2018, humid and sticky, the kind of night when the world feels too close. I woke up to Mom's voice cracking through the phone. She did not make sense at first. Then I heard the words that rewired my entire life. Caleb. Fentanyl. Gone. Gone. A word that should not belong to someone who was only 25 years old. I drove to their house without remembering how I got there. When I walked into his room, everything looked normal. His posters were still on the walls. His laptop sat open on the desk. A half-finished soda rested on the nightstand. Nothing in that room explained how he had slipped away from us. Nothing explained why no one saw the storm building inside him. Dad kept asking what happened, as if someone would give him a neat explanation. Mom kept repeating his name like she could pull him back with her voice. Marianne stormed into the room, blaming the doctor for prescribing too much. She said the real fault belonged to the people who made the pills. She said none of us could have known. But I knew. I knew the warning signs. I knew the statistics. I knew how quickly a painkiller could become a lifeline for someone sinking under their own thoughts. I knew, and I still trusted the system more than I trusted my own brother's words. Every decision I had made seemed so rational at the time, so medically appropriate. But none of it kept him alive. In the days that followed, I felt myself splitting in two. The part of me that loved him mourned him. The part of me that failed him analyzed everything, rewinding every conversation, every missed opportunity, every moment when he reached out, and I responded with logic instead of compassion. Grief and guilt twisted together until I could not separate them. Dad refused to talk about addiction. He said Caleb had been under too much stress. Mom said he had been sensitive. Marianne said he should have spoken up sooner. Everyone had an explanation that protected them from facing the truth. They saw Caleb as a problem that had suddenly appeared, not a person unraveling slowly over years. It was easier that way. Blame the moment instead of the pattern. The funeral was small, quiet. A few friends, some distant relatives. People hugged Mom and Dad and murmured how sorry they were. No one asked what could have been done differently. No one said his name in a way that made him sound real anymore. He became a tragedy instead of a person. After the service, I went back to my apartment and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, staring at my hands. These hands had held beating hearts in the operating room. These hands had made impossible decisions in emergencies. Yet somehow they had not been enough to keep my brother alive. Something inside me cracked that day. Not a dramatic break. More like a quiet split in the foundation I had always depended on. I had trusted the medical system completely. I had believed in protocols and procedures. I had believed in doing everything by the book. But the book had failed him, and so had I. For months after his death, I worked my shifts, kept my head down, and pretended nothing had changed. But everything had. The hospital hallways felt heavier. Patients' faces lingered with me long after I left their rooms. Every prescription pad I saw made my stomach twist. Every time someone mentioned pain management, I felt cold. I tried to talk to Dad about what happened. He brushed it aside and said, dwelling on the past would not help anyone. I tried to talk to Mom. She cried and said she needed peace, not more questions. I tried to talk to Marianne. She insisted the blame belonged to drug manufacturers and that none of us could have predicted anything. It was easier for all of them to turn away. I could not turn away. The more time passed, the more I saw Caleb in the faces of patients who slipped through the cracks, the ones who came in alone, the ones who had no one to advocate for them, the ones who were handed pills like they were bandages, covering wounds no one bothered to examine. One evening about 3 months after Caleb died, I sat in the staff lounge staring at the wall. A colleague asked if I was all right. I said yes. I lied. I felt like a hollow version of myself, a person going through motions she no longer believed in. That was the beginning of the end of the life I had known. I did not make a big decision that night. I did not quit or shout or demand change. It was quieter than that. A single steady realization that the world I had trusted was built on cracks. That doing everything right did not always save people. That sometimes it allowed them to fall further. I carried that realization for a long time before I acted on it. But that night, sitting alone at a table with my hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, I understood something that would shape every choice I made afterward. Systems do not save people. People save people. And I had already lost the one person I should have saved. That truth was the first fracture in the life I had built. It would not collapse all at once. It would give way slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the person I had been before. But for now, it was only a crack. A quiet break in the foundation. Something was shifting even if I could not yet name it. That quiet fracture stayed with me through the fall and into winter, until finally it pushed me to a decision I had spent months avoiding. In early 2019, I walked into the hospital where I had trained, where I had built my identity, and gave notice that I would be leaving neurosurgery for good. I remember the feel of the hallway under my shoes that morning, The familiar hum of fluorescent light, the scent of coffee drifting from the resident lounge. Everything looked the same, yet none of it fit anymore. When I told my department chief, his eyebrows lifted slightly, the way they did when a resident gave an unexpected answer during rounds. He asked if I was burnt out. I said yes, though that was only part of the truth. Burnout implies you have nothing left to give. I had plenty left, just not to that world. He reviewed my contract, told me he hoped I understood what I was walking away from, and wished me luck. His voice was polite, distant. Exactly what you would expect from someone trying not to reveal their own judgment. I felt strangely relieved that he did not try to talk me out of it. My colleagues were shocked. Some asked how I could throw away everything I had worked for. Others assumed I had another prestigious offer lined up. No one guessed the truth. That I was leaving because I could not keep practicing medicine in a system that had failed Caleb. A system I had been part of. I did not tell anyone the details. It felt too raw to share, and I feared saying the words out loud would make me crumble. So I kept my explanations simple. A change in direction, a need for something different, a desire to work more directly with people in crisis. Most nodded politely, though I could see the confusion behind their eyes. Neurosurgery was the mountaintop. Who climbs back down voluntarily? My final day at the hospital passed quietly. I handed off charts, cleaned out my locker, and slipped my ID badge into an envelope for the administrator. As I drove away that evening, the building receding in my rearview mirror, I felt like I had stepped out of a skin I had worn for too long. It did not feel liberating yet. It felt terrifying. Telling my family was harder than leaving the job. I waited until Sunday dinner in early spring, thinking it would be easier to explain in person. I was wrong. The moment I said I had resigned, the room dropped into a heavy silence. Dad set down his fork as if it suddenly weighed too much. His jaw tightened in a way I had seen only a few times in my life. He asked me if I had lost my mind. He asked why anyone would give up a respected career, a secure income, a future most people could only dream of. I tried to talk about Caleb, about how his death had changed everything. I tried to explain how I felt pulled toward the people who were drowning in the same currents that took him. Dad cut me off. He said personal tragedies were not reasons to throw away a career. He said grief passes, but consequences do not. He asked if I understood the financial implications of my decision. Mom pressed a napkin to her lips, like she was trying to hide her disappointment. She said she wished I had talked to them first. She said they could have helped me think it through. She said decisions made in sorrow rarely led to stable futures. I wanted her to ask how I felt. She never did. Marianne leaned back in her chair and exhaled sharply, the way she always did when she felt someone had embarrassed the family. She said quitting medicine was selfish. She said the community needed specialists, not impulsive martyrs. She said I was abandoning patients who trusted me. I tried to explain that I wanted to help people in a different way, a more human way. But she waved her hand and said it sounded like wishful thinking. It was the first time I realized Marianne respected the idea of me, not the reality. She respected the version of me that fit neatly beside her at family events, both of us dressed in professional clothes, both of us successful in ways that made our parents glow. She did not respect the version who questioned the system she worshipped. She did not respect the version who chose compassion over prestige. Dad stood and walked to the sink, turning on the faucet without saying anything. It was an old habit of his, running water whenever he was upset, as if the noise could drown out emotions he did not want to feel. Mom reached across the table as if she might touch my hand, then pulled her own back at the last second. The silence stretched for so long I considered getting up and leaving. Then Marianne said the thing that stayed with me longer than anything else. That night, she said I was wasting my potential, that there were thousands of people who would have given anything for the opportunities I had, that I was choosing to throw everything away because I could not handle one tragedy. I told her she did not understand. She said that was the problem. She said no one could understand why I was doing something so irresponsible. Dad finally turned off the water and asked where I planned to work now. When I said I did not know yet, that I needed time to find the right place, he shook his head. He said directionless people become burdens. He said I was too smart to become one. I left dinner early that night, the same way I would years later after the Christmas announcement. Only this time there had been no public humiliation, just a quiet unraveling of whatever respect they had once held for me. In the months that followed, I lived off my savings while I searched for my next step. I applied for grant programs, volunteered at shelters, studied every recovery model I could find. I had time for the first time in years, and instead of feeling rested, I felt restless. Every morning I woke up with a sense of urgency but no clear direction. The only constant was the ache that reminded me why I had walked away. Caleb. His absence moved with me through each day like a shadow that never found the right light. Friends from the hospital reached out occasionally. Some sent messages asking if I had changed my mind. A few invited me to coffee so they could assess whether I was unraveling or reinventing myself. I did not know the answer. I only knew I could not go back. My family checked in less often. Mom called occasionally, her voice soft and tentative. Dad barely spoke unless the conversation was about something practical. Marianne sent a single message reminding me that gaps in a resume were hard to recover from. I responded with a short reply thanking her for her concern. She did not write again. The distance between us grew like a widening shoreline. I still loved them. That never changed. But love does not erase disappointment. And disappointment does not build bridges. They had lost respect for me long before I lost my salary. They just hid it better back then. One afternoon in late autumn, I sat on a park bench overlooking a small playground. Children were running through leaves shrieking with joy, while their parents watched from picnic tables. I had gone there because I needed air and the apartment felt too small, too quiet. As I watched the kids throw handfuls of leaves into the air, I felt something familiar. That quiet shift inside me again. The recognition that the life I had left behind no longer had space for me, and the life I wanted did not exist yet. I reached into my bag and pulled out a notebook I had been carrying for months. It was filled with scribbled ideas, loose concepts, unfinished thoughts, things I had written down late at night when sleep felt too far away. There were notes about trauma-informed care, about art therapy, about peer mentoring, about holistic recovery programs in other states, about the gaps in the system that swallowed people like Caleb. As I flipped through the pages, I realized something. I had been waiting for my family to understand, waiting for a sign, waiting for permission from people who had already made it clear they did not support my choices, waiting because part of me still longed for validation I would never receive. If I kept waiting, nothing would ever change. I closed the notebook and held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it. It was not heavy, but it felt like a door, one that would stay closed if I did not open it myself. That was the moment I understood I could not build the next part of my life, on the hope that my family would someday applaud the choices I made. If they had not understood by then, they never would. If they had not respected the direction I was taking, they never would. If they had not believed I was capable of something beyond prestige and salary, they never would. Waiting for them had kept me paralyzed for almost a year. I stood from the bench as the wind picked up and leaves spiraled across the sidewalk. I slipped the notebook back into my bag and began walking toward my car. Each step felt strangely light, as if I had shed something invisible. The shift was still subtle, still forming, still fragile, but it was real, and it was mine. I slipped the notebook back into my bag and began walking toward my car, the wind lifting strands of hair around my face as if the world was nudging me forward. I did not know it then, but that quiet moment on the park bench was the beginning of Harbor Light. Even if the name had not existed yet, all I had was a pull in my chest and pages of ideas that seemed too big for one person to carry. But I carried them anyway. I spent the next few weeks driving through neighborhoods in Providence, scouting buildings that no one else seemed to want. The city had plenty of forgotten corners, and I found one tucked between a shuttered laundromat and a boarded-up hardware store. The building was brick, 3 floors, windows clouded with years of neglect. The interior smelled like mildew and old paint. But when I walked through the empty halls, I felt something flicker inside me. It had space. It had rooms that could hold people. It had potential waiting under the dust. The landlord seemed surprised that anyone was interested. He quoted a price and I countered with a number much lower. He stared at me for a long moment and finally agreed. I think he assumed I would quit once I saw how much work it needed. He did not know I had already left behind something much harder. I signed the lease a week later. The first few months were a blur of sanding walls, painting over graffiti, repairing floors, replacing broken fixtures, and trying to convince the city inspector that the building was safe enough for occupancy. I learned how to stretch a dollar so far it felt like rubber. I learned how to fix things I had never touched before. And I learned how much you can do when you no longer care about impressing anyone. Ivy was the first person I hired. She had been running art therapy programs for years and believed in recovery, through creativity more fiercely than anyone I had ever met. I interviewed her in the bare third-floor office while we sat on overturned paint buckets. She listened to my pitch, listened to my hopes for the place, and nodded slowly. Then she said she was in if I could handle someone who spoke her mind too much. I told her honesty was a requirement. Jonah joined 2 weeks later. He had spent more than a decade in social work and carried stories in his eyes that he rarely said out loud. He moved through the world like someone who had seen too many people fall and still refused to give up on them. When he walked through the building, he said it smelled like possibility. That was the moment I knew I needed him there. We named it Harbor Light because I wanted it to feel like a place where people could come in from the storm, a place where they could anchor until they were steady enough to sail again. I bought a small sign for the entrance with the name printed in simple black letters. It looked almost too modest, but something about that felt right. The first clients arrived slowly. A few came through referrals. A few walked in on their own. Some made it through the intake process only to disappear before the end of the week. We expected that. Addiction recovery is not linear, no matter how badly people on the outside want it to be. There were nights when Ivy and I sat in the office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at files of people who had relapsed and wondering if we had done enough. Jonah would remind us that showing up mattered even when the outcomes hurt. The hardest moments were the middle of the night calls, people trembling on the edge of something dangerous, or parents whispering into the phone because they were afraid of waking up the person they were terrified of losing. I took those calls sitting at my kitchen table, the glow of the lamp the only light in the room. Sometimes I guided them through breathing until they calmed down. Sometimes I called emergency responders. Sometimes I just listened while someone cried because they had nowhere else to put their pain. Not every story ended well. There were losses that stayed with me. A young woman named Kelsey who relapsed after her discharge and passed away 2 months later. A man named Anthony who was doing well until a single setback took him down a bye-a-die road he never returned from. Each time we lost someone, I felt a punch in my chest. But each time I walked back into Harbor Light the next morning because there were others waiting, others fighting, others trying to choose life again and again. My family watched all of this from a distance, their judgment sharp enough to cut through any progress I made. Dad called it a phase. Mom asked quietly if I had a backup plan in case the center failed. Marianne spoke loudly about liability and regulations, and what she called the inevitability that the government would eventually shut me down. She talked about the risk of lawsuits. She talked about the danger of using methods she did not understand. She talked about my irresponsibility like it was a character flaw she had, diagnosed years ago. Whenever I visited, she asked questions phrased like concerns but shaped like accusations. How many people had relapsed? How many had dropped out? How many had succeeded, though she rarely stayed long enough for the answer? She said one afternoon during a family gathering that running a center like Harbor Light was begging for trouble. She said places like mine get shut down all the time. She said I needed to be prepared for the day the authorities came knocking. I remember standing in the kitchen stirring coffee, feeling her words settle like stones in my stomach. Not because she was right, but because she wanted to be. Still, Harbor Light survived its first year, Arlie. We had more clients, more programs, more success stories than I ever expected for a place that had once felt like a forgotten building on a forgotten street. I remember the first graduation ceremony we held, a tiny gathering in the common room with folding chairs and store-bought cupcakes. The clients spoke about rediscovering pieces of their lives they thought were gone forever. I stood in the back of the room listening, feeling a type of pride I had never once felt in a hospital operating room. There were nights when I collapsed into bed too exhausted to even turn off the lamp beside me. There were mornings when I woke up afraid we would not have enough funding to make it through the month. But there were also afternoons when I watched someone smile for the first time in years, or evenings when Ivy led a group therapy session that left everyone lighter than when they walked in. There were victories that did not look like victories from the outside. someone calling their estranged sister, someone going 1 week without using, someone admitting the truth out loud for the first time. Those small things carried us. By the end of the year, I realized I had not thought about the hospital in months. I had not missed the long nights in the operating room or the constant pressure to be perfect. I missed the paycheck sometimes, especially when the center's expenses loomed, but not enough to regret leaving. Instead, I found myself thinking about Caleb more often, wondering what he would think if he could see Harbor Light, wondering if this place might have saved him, wondering if he would have made it through our front door and felt, even for a moment, that he was not alone. My family still did not understand. They still spoke about my choices with disapproval thick enough to hear before they even opened their mouths. But by then the distance did not hurt the way it once had. Harbor Light had become its own kind of family, a place built on second chances, a place where people were allowed to be unfinished and still worthy. As winter approached again, I locked up the center one evening and stood outside for a moment. The street was quiet. Snowflakes drifted down slowly, settling on the hood of my car. The building behind me glowed with warm light from the common room windows. I could hear faint laughter inside, clients playing cards while Ivy tidied up the art room. I felt the cold air fill my lungs as I looked at the sign above the door. Harbor Light, a name that had become a shelter for so many people, and, without me realizing, it had become one for me too. It was not perfect. It was not easy. It was not what my family wanted. But it was meaningful, and I finally believed that was enough. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The warmth slowly crept through the vents as snow continued to fall softly. Outside, I sat there for a long moment listening to the hum of the engine, feeling something I had not felt in years. Steady. That word stayed with me as I drove home through the quiet streets of Providence, the snow drifting under the streetlights in soft spirals. For the first time since Caleb died, I felt like my life had a direction that belonged entirely to me. I held on to that steadiness through the holidays, even through the sting of Marianne's announcement at Christmas dinner. I held on to it when I returned to Harbor Light the next morning and found Ivy, already brewing coffee and humming an old song under her breath. I held on to it when Jonah walked in with snow on his shoulders and asked if I was all right without pressing for an answer. But steadiness can shift quickly. 3 weeks after Christmas, it did. It was a Friday morning, cold and bright, the kind of morning when the air feels sharper than usual. I arrived at Harbor Light early because we were preparing for intake interviews. The common room smelled faintly of fresh paint and cinnamon from the muffins someone had left on the counter. I hung my coat on the hook behind my office door, sat down at my desk, and began sorting through the stack of forms that had appeared overnight. A soft knock sounded at the door. I looked up, expecting Jonah or one of the clients. Instead, a man stepped inside. Early 40s maybe. Trim haircut. Clean, formal clothing. He held his credentials in his hand, extended toward me. He introduced himself as Lucas Brennan from the federal agency overseeing compliance for recovery programs. His voice was firm but not unfriendly, the tone of someone who had delivered difficult news before. I reached out to take his ID card, and that was when he froze. Not his hand, his whole body. His eyes shifted past me to the wall behind my desk. The wall filled with photographs of every person Harbor Light had housed since the day we opened. Rows of faces, stories, small miracles, heartbreaks. People we had lost. People who had survived. People who were still fighting. Lucas stared at the wall, as if something had reached out and grabbed him. I turned, following his gaze. Second row. Near the center. A man holding a cup of coffee standing just outside our front door. His shoulders were thin, then his eyes tired and a little unfocused. His smile almost shy. I remembered taking that picture. Jonah had insisted we start documenting moments, even the small ones, because hope was easier to see than explain. The man in the photo had been quiet, skittish, apologizing for taking up space even when no one asked him to. I remembered his intake form, his trembling hands. His voice cracked when he said he did not think he would live through another winter. Lucas exhaled, barely audible. That is me. I turned fully to look at him. The man in front of me looked nothing like the man in the photo. His shoulders were broad, now solid, his face fuller. His eyes are clear and steady. Yet the resemblance was unmistakable. He stepped closer to the wall with slow steps, like he was afraid the picture might disappear if he moved too quickly. He lifted his hand toward it, but stopped short of touching the frame. "Second row center." He said it again, but this time his voice cracked. That was 2 years ago, 2021. I was living out of my car behind a hardware store on the west side. I weighed maybe 130 pounds. I was using it every day. He swallowed hard. "Your staff pulled me out of a parking lot when I called the crisis line." His breath shook. "You saved my life." I felt the room shift, not physically, but emotionally. A kind of slow collapse inward. I remembered him now. I remembered the cold night we found him, huddled in the driver's seat of a rusted sedan. I remembered the blanket Ivy wrapped around him, the way he cried when we told him he could stay. But I had no words. Not yet. Lucas lowered his hand and stepped back, composing himself. He cleared his throat and returned to that professional posture again, though it did not fit as neatly as it had when he first entered. "I need to say this clearly. I cannot be assigned to this case. It is a direct conflict of interest. I will file a recusal as soon as I leave this building." I nodded, relieved but also uneasy. If he recused himself, another inspector would come. Someone who did not know Harbor Light. Someone who might see only the imperfections and not the intent. Someone who might listen to Marianne's report and assume the worst. Lucas continued, "Before I go, I need you to understand something. This audit was flagged as high priority." His eyes met mine. "Someone filed a very detailed complaint accusing you of serious violations. Not misunderstandings. Accusations." I did not ask who filed it. I already knew. He took a slow breath. "I am not here to help you avoid scrutiny. That would be wrong. But I can tell you this. Harbor Light saved me when nothing else did, and I have never forgotten that." He hesitated, his voice softening. "I want you to know that whatever happens next, at least one person out there owes you their life." He stepped toward the door, paused, and looked back at the wall one more time before leaving my office. I could still feel the echo of his presence after he walked away, the quiet weight of what he had said lingering in the air. As soon as the door closed, I sat down. My hands were trembling lightly, but not from fear. Not yet. It was the quiet realization that the past never completely lets go. It circles back in the most unexpected ways. By Monday morning, I received an official notice. Another inspector had been assigned. Her name was Valerie Madsen. Her email was brief, clipped, and professional. She requested full access to financial records treatment protocols, staff files, client discharge summaries, and any documentation regarding our therapeutic methods. It was everything I expected and everything I dreaded. Jonah found me in the office that afternoon, sitting at my desk with the printed notice in front of me. He leaned against the door frame, crossed his arms, and asked what happened. I handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation to something more, controlled. He set the paper down and asked whether Marianne had anything to do with it. I nodded once. He let out a low breath, the kind that says he is controlling a much bigger reaction. Jonah cared deeply about the people we served, and he hated anything that threatened the stability we worked so hard to build. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "The only thing we can do. Show them everything." Ivy joined us a few minutes later after hearing the news through the thin walls. She sat on the edge of my desk and picked at a loose thread on her sleeve while she listened. She was quiet for a moment, then said she trusted our work. She trusted our integrity. She trusted that even under a microscope, Harbor Light would hold. But she also knew audits were slow, invasive, and exhausting. Over the next few days, we organized files until our eyes blurred. We labeled binders and scanned documents and arranged stacks of paperwork into categories that made sense only if you had spent months inside the system. I cleaned my office twice, not because I needed it, but because I needed something to occupy my hands. On Wednesday afternoon, a letter arrived confirming the date the audit would begin. The inspector would arrive the following week. 7 days to prepare. I left the building early that evening and walked to the small park a few blocks away. The air was cold enough to bite the tip of my nose. I sat on a bench watching a couple push a stroller along the path. The sky was a pale shade of gray, the kind that promises snow without delivering it. I thought about Lucas, about the picture on the wall, about the way his voice shook when he said we had saved his life. And I thought about how that same life had brought him back to my office in a way no one could have predicted. There was something strangely comforting in that. Proof that what we did mattered. Proof that even in the middle of fear there was something solid underneath. When I returned to Harbor Light later that night, the lights from the common room spilled softly into the hallway. Clients were gathered around a table playing cards. Ivy was laughing at something one of them said. Jonah was helping someone fill out a housing application. It looked ordinary, safe. Humans. I stood there in the doorway watching them all for a moment. This was the work. This was the reason. And no audit, no accusation, no report filed out of resentment could undo what had already been built. The fear was still there, of course. I would have been lying to myself if I said otherwise. But it was no longer the loudest feeling. There was something stronger beneath it. A determination I had not felt since the day I opened Harbor Light. The audit would come, we would face it, and we would do it honestly with nothing to hide. As I turned off the lights and locked up for the night, the steady feeling returned. Faint but present. Enough to carry me through whatever waited on the other side of the door. I locked up for the night, the key turning in the door with a soft click, and breathed in the cold air as if it might steady me again. The quiet held for only a few days before the next shift came. The audit began on a Tuesday morning. I arrived early, hoping to settle my nerves before the inspector showed up. But she was already there when I walked through the door. A woman in her mid-50s stood in the lobby, her back straight, a folder tucked under her arm. Her expression was unreadable professional to the point of being almost blank. She introduced herself as Renee Caldwell. Her voice was low and even, the kind that belonged to someone who had spent decades sifting through truths and excuses. She did not shake hands. She simply nodded once and asked to be shown to a workspace where she could review documents without interruption. I led her to the conference room. She did not comment on the framed artwork on the walls, pieces created by clients during therapy. She did not acknowledge Jonah's polite greeting. She walked in, set her folder on the table, and immediately asked for our financials going back 5 years. 5 years. Harbor Light had only existed for a little over 4, but I did not correct her. I collected the binders we had prepared and placed them in front of her. She opened the first one, scanned a page, and said she would also need our payroll records treatment protocols, expense ledgers, and any documentation showing where our donations had come from. Her tone was not hostile. It was clinical, detached. The tone of someone who expected to find a problem and would not be surprised when she did. Once she had everything, she finally opened the complaint. I had not seen the details. I had not asked Lucas to tell me. Part of me did not want to know what Marianne had said, because knowing would make it real in a way that felt heavier than anything she had ever thrown at me before. But there it was, printed in black ink. The first accusation was embezzlement. She claimed I had been siphoning donation money for personal use. According to her, I had created a charity that existed only to make me appear noble while padding my own pockets. Renee looked at me over the top of the page. Your salary is $52,000 a year. Is that correct? Yes. She blinked once slowly. You have a medical degree and surgical training, and you make $52,000 a year. That is correct. She made a small note on her clipboard, not looking pleased or displeased, just documenting. The next accusation was that Harbor Light used dangerous and unapproved treatment methods, that our art therapy, movement therapy, and peer mentoring were not clinically justified, that we were running what she described as an experimental program without oversight. Renee read that section silently, her mouth tightening at the corners. I provided studies outcome reports and documentation of every training certification our staff held. She did not respond. She simply took the paperwork, added it to her pile, and asked for the results of our last independent audit. I gave her the binder, thick and worn at the edges from constant reference. The audit had been thorough, clean, transparent, every dollar accounted for, every discrepancy explained. The third accusation was fraud, deliberate, premeditated, malicious. It claimed that Harbor Light was a scam designed to lure vulnerable people into a program that offered substandard treatment while presenting itself as holistic and reputable. It went as far as stating that we endangered clients by failing to provide proper medical supervision. Renee read that section twice. I could see her eyes moving back and forth across the page, her brows drawing together in subtle concentration. I waited. Finally, she closed the file. Where do these accusations come from? I chose my words carefully. A family member who disagrees with the work we do. She did not ask which one. She did not ask why. She simply nodded once and began outlining the next steps of the audit. On-site evaluations, client interviews, review of therapeutic protocols, examination of our financial deposits, spot checks of staff credentials. I agreed to everything, because transparency was the only defense we had. By noon, she was settled into the conference room, surrounded by stacks of documents. I left her alone and went back to my office. The moment the door closed, I let out a breath I had been holding since she arrived. My phone buzzed. A message from Marianne. Heard the inspector showed up. Hope you are ready for what comes next. Another message followed. You can still shut the place down voluntarily. Might save you from a worse outcome. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. She had not asked how I was. She had not asked how the clients were. She had not asked about anything except the satisfaction she seemed to draw from tearing down what I had built. I typed a response, then deleted it. Dad did not reach out at all. Neither did Mom. They said nothing publicly, but their silence felt like a choice. A quiet alignment with Marianne. A subtle declaration that if there was conflict in the family, it was easier to stand with the daughter whose life made sense to them. Jonah knocked on my door mid-afternoon. He held a mug of coffee steam drifting upward. She has been at it for hours. How are you holding up? I shrugged. He sat in the chair across from me. You know, this is not about you personally. This is about someone who does not want to understand the work we do. You cannot control that. I nodded, but my throat felt tight. It was not the accusations themselves that hurt the most. It was knowing they had come from someone who knew me. Someone who had grown up beside me, shared childhood memories, sat at the same dinner table for decades. Harbor Light was the thing I had built out of grief and loss and stubborn hope. It was the thing I poured every part of myself into. And to her it was nothing more than a liability waiting to explode. By the second day of the audit, Renee had moved on to interviewing staff. Ivy came to my office afterward, pale but composed. She said the questions were intense but fair. Nothing sensational. Nothing accusatory. Ivy folded her arms and leaned against my door. She wants the truth, that is all. And that is what we have. Jonah's interview followed. Then several clients volunteered to speak with her. I watched them walk into the conference room one by one. People who had survived overdoses, homelessness, estranged families, spirals of relapse and recovery. People who had fought tooth and nail to reclaim their lives. People who trusted us with their most fragile moments. I wondered if Marianne had ever spoken to a single person like them. I doubted she had. That evening, after Renee left for the day, I sat alone in my office as the sun went down. The building grew quiet, except for the soft hum of the heater and occasional footsteps from the hallway. My gaze drifted to the wall of photographs, the same wall Lucas had stared at. Faces, stories, lives rebuilt piece by piece. I whispered a question into the empty room. How could anyone look at this and think of harm? The truth settled into me, slowly like ink sinking into paper. Marianne was not attacking the work. She was attacking me. The work was just collateral damage. And that realization hurt more than any accusation she could have written. When the third day began, I was calmer. Not because the audit felt less threatening, but because something inside me had shifted. I was not here to protect my pride. I was not here to defend myself against her bitterness. I was here to protect my clients. To protect the people who had walked through our doors expecting safety and dignity. If that meant answering hundreds of questions, handing over every document, and allowing every corner of Harbor Light to be inspected, then that was what I would do. I had already lost my brother to a system that cared more about paperwork than people. I refused to lose anyone else. That afternoon, Renee requested records from our earliest months. I retrieved them, placing the folders on the table in front of her. She thanked me briefly, then began reviewing them with the same meticulous calm. As I watched her work, something surprising happened. The fear began to fade. Not disappear entirely, but settle into something manageable. Because transparency was not the enemy, and truth did not crumble under scrutiny. By the end of the week, I knew one thing with complete clarity. I was not fighting Marianne. I was protecting Harbor Light. The audit would end eventually. The findings would speak for themselves. And whatever happened after that, I would face it. Not for my ego. For the people whose lives were intertwined with the center. For the ones who were still learning how to believe they deserved a future. For the ones who could not afford to lose the only place that had ever felt safe. I closed the conference room door behind me and walked toward my office, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle across my shoulders. It did not crush me. It steadied me. I carried that steadiness with me into the days that followed, even as the audit pressed deeper into every corner of Harbor Light. By the end of the week, I felt wrung out but not broken. When Saturday arrived, I almost forgot about the family dinner Mom had been reminding me about for days. Part of me knew I should cancel. The other part knew I needed to go, if only to stop avoiding the truth I'd been circling for months. So I went. The house looked the same as it always did. The porch light glowed warmly against the fading evening, and the familiar scent of roasted chicken drifted out the moment Mom opened the door. She hugged me tightly, too tightly, the way she always did when she sensed something was wrong but refused to ask. Dad was already at the table, flipping through the newspaper even though dinner had not been served. Marianne sat beside him, scrolling on her phone with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed she belonged at the center of every room she entered. I hung my coat on the rack and took my seat. The conversation was harmless at first. Weather, work, small-town gossip. Dad asked about Providence traffic, not Harbor Light. Mom asked if I was eating enough vegetables. Marianne asked nothing at all. We were halfway through dinner when she finally spoke. She set down her fork, folded her napkin neatly, and looked at me with an expression so composed it almost hid the coldness underneath. People like them do not recover without consequences. The words hung in the air, heavy, final. I did not know what stunned me more, the statement itself or the casual way she said it, as if she were reciting a simple fact she had learned in a textbook. Dad cleared his throat softly, but he did not correct her. Mom lowered her eyes. No one challenged the idea that the people I worked with were somehow less deserving of grace, less deserving of hope, less deserving of anything except punishment. I felt my heartbeat rise slow but strong. People like who I asked. She lifted one shoulder in a shrug. Addicts. People who bring their problems on themselves. People who expect the world to fix what they broke. My hands tightened around my water glass. Is that how you see Lucas? She frowned, confused. Who? The inspector. I said. The one who recused himself because he was a former client. He was one of your people, as you put it. And he recovered without being punished. She blinked, but her expression stayed hard. That is just one case. Then what about Maya? I asked. She has been clean for 2 years. She went back to school. She volunteers at Harbor Light every week. Does she count? Or is she also one of them? Marianne shifted in her seat. She did not like being challenged. She never had. I am sure there are a few outliers, she said, but the majority do not change unless something forces them to. Something like consequences. Her tone was clinical, as if she were talking about business projections instead of human beings. Mom glanced between us, worried about creasing her forehead. She murmured that we should not argue during dinner, but she did not tell Marianne she was wrong. She did not ask her to stop. She simply wanted the tension to pass quietly. Dad set down his newspaper and said he wished I would not take everything so personally. It was just an opinion. Everyone has one. My throat tightened. It was not just an opinion. It was the belief system that had shaped the way my family treated Caleb. The belief that addiction was a moral failing, not an illness. That suffering was deserved. That help should be conditional. That love should be conditional. I felt something rising inside me, slow at first, then steady. You talk about consequences, I said quietly. But the only consequences Caleb ever faced were shame and isolation. He needed support. He needed understanding. And all he ever heard was that he should have tried harder. Marianne did not even flinch. He made his choices. The words landed like a stone dropped into dark water. I set down my fork and looked at her directly. Something I had not done in years. People recover because someone believes they can, not because someone punishes them, and certainly not because their own family decides they are not worth saving. She exhaled sharply, annoyed. You are twisting my words. No, I am finally hearing them. The room went still. Even Dad lowered his newspaper fully, though he still avoided my eyes. Mom reached for the serving dish, pretending she needed to rearrange something on the table. No one spoke for several long seconds. I continued, my voice steady. You do not understand the people I work with. You do not want to understand them. And you do not want to understand me. You love the version of me that fits your expectations. The version who wore scrubs and had a prestigious job and never caused trouble. The version who made sense to you. Dad stiffened. Mom's hands shook slightly. Marianne's eyes narrowed. I kept going. But you do not love who I am now. You love who I was supposed to be. And the moment I stepped outside that path, you treated me like a problem to fix, like Caleb, like every person who has ever struggled under the weight of something you refused to see. Marianne leaned forward. If you had stayed in medicine, none of this would be happening. You would not be risking your future on something you cannot sustain. You would not be under federal investigation. You would not be embarrassing our family. There it was. The truth beneath every word she had spoken since the day I left neurosurgery. I stood slowly, pushing back my chair. I am not embarrassing this family. I am simply not performing for it anymore. Mom whispered my name softly, a fragile plea. I kissed her forehead. I am not angry, I said. I am done. Dad spoke my name once sternly, like I was a child disobeying him. But I did not sit down. I did not apologize. I did not soften myself to make the moment easier for them, because the truth was not supposed to be easy. I walked to the doorway, reached for my coat, and pulled it on. The house felt too warm, too small, too heavy with old expectations. I needed air. When I stepped outside, the night hit me like a clean breath. Cold, clear, honest. I walked to my car without looking back, the sound of my footsteps steady against the sidewalk. For the first time in a long time, I felt a boundary settle into place inside me. Solid, unmistakable. I was not abandoning my family. I was choosing myself. The words stayed with me as I drove home that night, the dark road stretching ahead of me like a clean, quiet promise. I did not know it then, but karma had already begun to move, slow and cold and precise, in ways I did not control and never could have orchestrated. The audit concluded 2 weeks later. It ended on a Thursday morning, the kind of morning where the air felt heavy with the possibility of snow. Renee called me into the conference room. She stood beside a stack of binders, her hands folded in front of her, her posture as composed as ever. Jonah sat to my left, Ivy to my right. I could feel their quiet support like steady anchors. Renee opened her folder and began with the formal language. Findings, compliance, documentation verified, proper oversight, safety protocols. She spoke methodically, each word measured, her tone neutral. But then she closed the folder and looked up. Harbor Light is operating at an exceptional level. The treatment methods you use are clinically sound. The financial records are transparent and meticulously maintained. There is no evidence of mismanagement, negligence, or fraud. My breath tightened, then released slowly. Ivy let out a small sound, half laugh and half exhale. Jonah nodded once, the way he does when something finally feels right. Renee continued. Based on all findings, Harbor Light meets or exceeds federal guidelines in every evaluated category. The center will be officially documented as a model program. Model program. I stared at her, trying to let the words settle into me. After weeks of worry, after the weight of accusations that cut deeper because they came from my own sister, the validation felt both surreal and strangely quiet. Then Renee straightened her stance, signaling we were not finished. There is another matter that must be addressed. The complaint was filed against this center. My stomach tightened again. The report contained claims that were not only unfounded, but written with a level of specificity that indicates malicious intent. She tapped the folder lightly. We conducted a standard review of the complainant. Standard review. I knew enough to understand what that meant. When someone files a report, the agency checks for conflicts of interest. Renee continued. The complainant holds financial ties to a pharmaceutical distribution network that profits from certain forms of addiction treatment, treatments that compete with the low-cost recovery model you provide here. I felt Jonah stiffen beside me. Ivy's hand shifted against her knee, fingers curling tightly. Renee kept going in her even voice. Furthermore, the complainant failed to disclose this conflict. As a result, the filing has been marked as a false report, motivated by personal or Financial bias. This designation is permanent. It will follow the complainant across all regulatory inquiries moving forward. Permanent. A word that lands without raising its voice. I swallowed. My chest felt warm and heavy, but not with victory. It was something else, something quieter. She closed the folder. There will be no criminal charges. False reporting laws are rarely prosecuted unless there is demonstrable harm to public safety or large-scale financial loss. However, the consequences on the professional side are significant and immediate. She paused. The complainant has been removed from one federal advisory panel and is currently suspended from a regional professional council pending review. This is not something that can be appealed easily. I let the information settle piece by piece. Harbor light cleared. Recognized. Protected. Marianne exposed. Documented. Marked not by me but by her own choices. I had done nothing except tell the truth. Renee gathered her binders and thanked us for our cooperation. Before leaving the room, she looked at me for a long, quiet moment. You have built something remarkable here. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. When she left, the room stayed silent long enough for me to hear the faint hum of the heating. Vents! Ivy reached across the table and grabbed my hand. You did this, she said. You saved this place. Jonah shook his head gently. She did not save it. She built it strong enough that it could withstand the storm. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the truth of it. I had expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, angry, relieved. Instead, I felt steady again. The same steadiness that had carried me off the park bench months before. Later that afternoon, Jonah came into my office holding his phone. He looked conflicted, almost uncomfortable. You should see this, he said. It was a memo circulating in Marianne's professional network. Dry, formal language. But the message was undeniable. Due to conflict of interest concerns regarding a recent federal review, Dr. Marianne Hale will be stepping down from her committee position effective immediately. Her name, in black and white, followed by consequences she had created for herself. No lawsuits, no confrontations, no dramatic confrontations, just reality arriving exactly where it was due. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of everything settling over me like a blanket, not heavy but final. Jonah hesitated before speaking again. You know you did not do this to her. The system did. I nodded. I knew. But knowing did not erase the complicated ache in my chest. Karma does not rush. It moves in cold, precise lines. It does not shout. It simply arrives. By the weekend, word had spread quietly across her medical circles. A few colleagues unfriended her on social networks. A professional mentor released a statement distancing herself. She was not fired, not disgraced publicly, but the doors began to close. Invitations stopped. Recommendations were withdrawn. Reputation once cracked never regains its old shine. Mom called Sunday evening, her voice trembling slightly. Have you heard about your sister? I kept my tone steady. I heard the audit concluded. Her silence said everything she did not want to. Dad did not call at all. I sat on my couch afterward, the room dim except for the lamp near the window. Outside snow fell in slow, drifting patterns, the kind that looked peaceful only from a warm place. I thought of Caleb. I thought of Lucas. I thought of every person who had walked through Harbor Light's doors searching for something solid to hold on to. And I thought of the long line of choices that had brought me to this exact moment. Not one part of me felt celebratory. This was not a triumph. It was the truth settling into place. Marianne had thrown a stone at something built from grief and compassion and relentless work. The stone had struck nothing but her own reflection. I stood and walked to the wall of photographs, letting my fingers rest lightly on the frame of the newest image. A young woman named Sierra, smiling shyly on the day she moved into transitional housing. She had survived more than most people could imagine. She had fought her way back to herself. People recover. People change. People matter. Anyone who cannot see that creates their own consequences. As the snow fell heavier outside, I realized something. Karma had never required my participation. It had been moving on its own the entire time. And it had finally arrived exactly where it was meant to. That truth stayed with me long after the snow stopped falling. In the days that followed, life at Harbor Light returned to its normal rhythm. Intakes, group sessions, art workshops, late-night crisis calls. The ordinary work of holding people together while they learn to hold themselves. But outside those walls, the consequences of Marianne's choices kept unfolding in quiet, relentless ways. 3 days after the audit officially closed, I received a message from an old colleague who worked at a hospital near Boston. She had trained with Marianne during residency, and though we were not close, she felt the need to reach out. She did not get the appointment, the message said. The board voted yesterday. They knew about the federal flag on her record. I sat at my desk for a moment staring at those words. Not in triumph, not in satisfaction, in recognition. She had been campaigning for that appointment for more than a year. It was the position she believed would prove once and for all that she belonged at the top of her field. A position she assumed was hers until the moment it was not. She had not lost it because of me. She had lost it because she built her reputation on certainty, and certainty collapses fast when people discover it was borrowed power. Later that afternoon, Jonah came into my office to tell me something else he had heard through the professional grapevine. A few local physicians who used to send patients to Marianne had quietly stopped giving referrals. Not out of revenge, not out of malice, out of caution, out of concern for what they called judgment issues. That phrase lingered with me long after Jonah left. Judgment issues. The words my family had thrown at Caleb for years. Words that now circled back to my sister, not because she struggled with addiction, but because she misused her authority, because she weaponized her credibility against something she did not understand, because she mistook power for wisdom. I did not feel vindicated. I did not feel pleased. I felt distant, a door closing gently but firmly. The following Sunday, Mom invited me over for dinner. I debated whether to go, but I knew avoiding my family forever was not realistic, and I wanted to measure what had changed. When I walked in, Marianne was already sitting at the table. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way she held herself. Her shoulders were stiff, her jaw was tight. Her eyes flickered to me and then away as if she were bracing for impact. Dad was quieter than usual, flipping through the channels even though the television was muted. Mom moved around the kitchen with a frantic kind of cheerfulness, trying to cover the tension with recipes. No one mentioned the audit. No one mentioned the report. No one mentioned her suspension from the regional council. But the silence said everything. Dad asked me about Harbor Light, not with pride, not with excitement, but with something closer to caution, maybe even curiosity, as if he was finally trying to see the place on its own merits instead of through Marianne's interpretations. Mom placed a dish on the table and whispered that she had heard the center was featured in a small article online. She said it with the tone of someone trying to offer an olive branch even, though her hands were shaking. Marianne stayed quiet the entire meal. When I spoke, she kept her eyes on her plate. When someone addressed her, she answered in clipped sentences. Not rude, not angry, just diminished. Something had shifted in the family dynamic. The pedestal she had stood on for years was no longer there. They still loved her, but they did not defer to her the same way. They did not look to her for the final word. And that absence filled the room like a draft, coming through a door left open. Too long. After dinner, Mom asked me to help her in the kitchen. We washed dishes side by side, our hands moving through warm water and soap light enough to feel fragile. She spoke softly. Things have been hard for your sister. I nodded. I did not say anything else. Mom hesitated before continuing. She made a mistake, a serious one, but she is still family. I listened carefully. I heard the plea behind her words. The request for forgiveness. The request for understanding. But something in me had matured in the week since Christmas dinner. I was no longer standing in the shadow of their expectations. I was no longer apologizing for the life I had chosen. I dried my hands and faced her gently. I know she is family, but she is also someone who tried to destroy the work I do. Work that saves people. Work that honors Caleb. And she did it because she could not stand the idea that I found meaning in something outside the path she approves of. Mom closed her eyes as if the truth pained her. I do not hate her, I said quietly, but I will not pretend nothing happened. Her consequences belong to her, not to me. Mom nodded slowly. She knew I was right. She also knew it hurt her to admit it. Later, when I walked to my car, Marianne followed me outside. For a moment, I thought she was going to apologize. She stopped a few feet away, her breath visible in the cold air. She struggled for words. "Everything is ruined because of you." The sentence cracked, brittle and defensive. "Not because of me," I said. "Because you lied." She shook her head angrily. "I was trying to help." "No, you were trying to control." She glared at me, then looked away, her anger collapsing under its own weight. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. "You think you are so righteous." I exhaled. I think I stopped pretending. She said nothing else. She turned and walked back inside. Her posture stiff with resentment she did not know how to release. That night, I drove home with the windows cracked open just enough to feel the cold air on my face. It kept me awake, grounded and present. Marianne had lost things she would never admit out loud. She lost her appointment. She lost the trust of her colleagues. She lost her reputation for perfect judgment. And she had lost the unquestioning loyalty of a family that once believed she could do no wrong. But what struck me most was not what she lost. It was what I kept. Harbor Light continued to grow. Clients flourished. Our team strengthened. A community formed around something built from grief, compassion, and relentless hope. I found myself laughing more often, staying later at the center, not because I was exhausted, but because I wanted to be there. People brought in coffee for one another. They celebrated small victories. They started calling Harbor Light home, even when they had apartments of their own. One night during a group session, a man named Eric said he had not felt like part of a family in more than a decade. Then he looked around the circle and said he felt like he had found one again. Later, as I locked up, I realized I had found mine too. A family not chosen by blood. A family chosen by truth. A family earned, not inherited. I stood in the empty hallway, the soft hum of the heating system echoing faintly, and understood the price of not compromising. I had lost some people. I had lost the illusion of my family's unconditional acceptance. I had lost the comfort of belonging to the version of myself they once approved of, but I had kept my integrity, my purpose, my voice, my capacity to love without control, my belief that people can heal in the right light. And those were the things that mattered. As I stepped out into the cold night, locking the door behind me, I felt the weight of everything I had fought for settle into my bones. I did not need my family to understand me. I only needed to keep walking the path that felt true, the one that brought people back to themselves gently, quietly, one life at a time. Lucas had gone home for the night, but his words stayed with me like a steady echo. He had said he was proud of Harbor Light, proud of what we had built, proud to stand beside me as proof that recovery was real. After he left, I walked the quiet hallway toward the common room where the fundraising event would be held the next evening. The tables were already arranged, the chairs set neatly in rows, the light soft and warm against the freshly painted walls. I paused in front of the far wall, the wall of faces, more than 2,000 photographs now. Every one of them was a person who had come through these doors searching for something sturdier than rock bottom, a face that had survived what their families or the world or their own fear told them they could not. I traced one photograph lightly with my fingertips. A young man named Raymond who had gone from sleeping under a bridge near the interstate to finishing his first semester in community college. This was the answer to everything. This wall. This quiet testimony that transformation is possible even when people write you off. I stood there a long time, letting the truth wash through me. The next evening, the event filled the building with voices and soft music and the quiet hum of conversations. Volunteers moved between tables. Clients in transitional housing helped serve food. Donors handed coats to staff at the entrance and looked around with a sense of curiosity and hope. Then Lucas arrived in a dark suit that made him look older and younger at the same time. He shook hands with Jonah and Ivy, then came to stand beside me. He looked at the wall the way someone looks at an old photograph of themselves, that they are still learning to accept as part of their story. He said he still remembered the night he walked through our doors. He remembered the way his hands shook. He remembered how he kept waiting for someone to ask him to leave. He said Harbor Light had given him the first piece of dignity he had felt in years. He said he would never forget that. Not even on the day he retired. I felt my throat tighten, but I stayed quiet. It was enough just to stand there beside him. When I stepped up to the small stage to welcome everyone, the room went still. Soft lights shone across the faces of people who believed in us, people who had trusted us, people who had survived because they found this place. I looked at them and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the lamps. I began to speak slowly at first. I talked about Harbor Light's first year, when we had no furniture and scraped together enough donations to buy folding chairs. I talked about the long nights and the setbacks and the victories that were sometimes no bigger than a phone call made in courage. I talked about the people whose lives were still unfolding and the ones we carried in our hearts. And then gently, I talked about the Christmas dinner that had almost destroyed everything. I did not say Marianne's name. I did not need to. I simply told the truth. Someone had called this center a fake charity. Someone had tried to shut us down. Someone had believed their credentials gave them the right to decide who deserved hope and who did not. But the audit did not break us. It strengthened us. It proved that integrity has a way of speaking even when we are tired and afraid. It showed that the work we do is not fragile. It is resilient. I paused. I looked at the wall again. The truth answered itself. Harbor Light exists because healing is possible, because compassion is stronger than shame, because people deserve a place where they are not defined by the worst chapter of their lives. I did not mention the consequences Marianne faced. I did not mention the federal record or the positions she lost, or the colleagues who no longer referred patients. That was her journey and her responsibility, not mine. But I understood it finally and fully. She had not wanted to destroy me. She had wanted to destroy the version of me that no longer needed her approval. She had wanted to reclaim the role of the righteous one, the successful one, the unquestioned one. And in doing so, she revealed the truth she had worked so hard to hide. You cannot claim moral superiority while harming someone who saves lives. The world saw that. Her colleagues saw that. And even if my family never said it out loud, they saw it too. After the speeches, people mingled again. Music rose softly. A few guests walked to the wall and studied the photographs with tender curiosity. I slipped to the side to breathe for a moment and found Lucas standing there. Again. He looked at the faces for a long time, then said something that settled neatly into my heart. This wall answers every question that ever mattered. I turned my head slightly. What question is that? He smiled faintly. Whether it was worth it. I breathed out slowly. Yes, it was worth it. Every doubt, every sleepless night, every argument, every loss, every boundary I had learned to draw, every step away from the family expectation that once felt like the ground under my feet. I had built something sturdy, something honest, something that outlived the judgments people had placed on me. By the end of the night, the last guests filtered out through the entrance. Volunteers gathered stray plates and folded tablecloths. Ivy joked that her feet hurt, then hugged me with her whole heart. Jonah gave me a quiet nod that carried more weight than most paragraphs. When everyone else had gone, I walked one more time to the wall. The lights were dimmer now, and the room sat in a kind of peaceful hush. I let my hand drift across the photographs. 2,000 faces, 2,000 lives, 2,000 reasons to keep going. I thought of Caleb then, not with pain but with something closer to gratitude. He had not lived to see Harbor Light, but he had pushed me toward it in the only way he could. His absence had carved a path I never expected to walk. I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed in the quiet. This was my family now. This place, these people, this work. And choosing myself had never meant choosing loneliness. It meant choosing the truth, choosing integrity, choosing a life built on compassion instead of fear. When I turned to leave, the reflection of the wall flickered in the window. For a moment, it looked like the faces were glowing, lit from within by their own small victories. I stepped into the night air, cool and clean against my skin. The sky stretched above me in a deep, quiet blue. Somewhere down the street, someone laughed. Somewhere else, a door closed softly. Life continued, and so did I. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.